All right, today, as the title slide shows you, we're going to be taking a look at the House and the Senate, the two different groups in our Congress and our legislative branch, and take a look at what they do together, but also what they do apart, because the House and the Senate are different, created to be different, and they have different powers, duties, and responsibilities. By now, you should have seen in class the aspect of the Great Compromise that created these, but if not, I'll refer to that in just a second. So, our objective today is to do what it says here, to take an overview of Congress's power, to look at the House and Senate members being different, as well as their elections, too. We'll talk about how they get elected in this description as well. So this will take us even beyond some of the powers aspect as to how people get elected and doing their jobs. So we're looking at the legislative branch of our three branches of government first. We'll then move on to the executive branch and the presidency later. And then the judicial branch is what we'll kind of close with for the three branches of government. That's not going to mean government's over with as far as our topics. We've got more things to go with this. But we'll start off with the basic structure of government and look at who does what in our shared power system. So your job is what it usually is. Watch. Any questions that come to mind, write those down, type those out, put it someplace where you have it saved, because that's what we can start class with. And this is a really good tool to use for you to get questions answered for not just yourself, but for other students. People can have questions usually. So don't hesitate to do that. As I always say with my videos, just because you have a question doesn't mean you've missed something or it's a bad thing. I know when I'm explaining this, it makes sense to me, but of course it would. I'm the one explaining it. It may not come across the way that I want it to come across to you. So that's where the questions come in very handy. So please write down anything that comes to mind, even if it just triggers a curiosity based on something you may know in the world of government and politics. So please do that for me. It will add to the discussion. And that's the one thing I really miss about doing lessons this way and not having you here in front of me, is that we usually get a pretty good discussion coming, because when we talk about it in class, questions do arise. People just kind of have, hey, I'm reminded of something. Here's what I'm wondering. And they throw it out there, and it really turns into a very good, meaningful discussion that benefits all of us. So I can't recreate that completely, but I'd like to try as best we can. So questions, please be thinking and recording those. All right, so let's recap here. The Great Compromise created a House and a Senate to be fair to all our types of states. And that was true both then and now. When I say all our types of states, we're talking about big states and small states. Not geographically, but population size. Even today, we've got that issue, don't we? California being a really big state with, I think, 27 to 28 million people. Maine with 1 million people, a little bit more. And that's a very big difference as far as the population size of our states. And Maine's not even the smallest. And Wyoming is population-wise. It has about 600,000 people. So you're talking about a huge difference in size between our states. The goal of our government, though, is to have a team, a union, to have our states, 13 then, 50 now, working together. So we had to find a system of government that was fair and that represented big states and small states fairly. And the only way to do that was to have two groups in our Congress, our House and our Senate. Our House based on population. Big states in the House get more representatives there. Out of the 435 total members, Maine has 2. Like I said, we're a small state. California has 53. Massachusetts, I think, has 10, I believe, is what they have these days. More than we do, that's for sure. But in the Senate, Maine benefits very well because we're equal to California and New York and Texas and Florida. Every state's got 2 votes. And in that way, states are represented fairly. Big states control the House. Small and medium-sized states have way more votes in the Senate because there's more of them than big states. And any bill, any policy, any law has to be adopted and passed by both. And that is the primary function, making laws and policies. And if you weren't in class, the difference between a law and a policy, law is what we all know. It tells people what to do. Policies are just actions of government, such as we're going to spend $200 million to build battleships. That's not a law, but it is a policy, meaning the government is taking some action. Congress makes laws and makes policies. It is their primary function. And when I say Congress, you're seeing right down there in orange. Congress is when we refer to both the House and Senate together, because they act together as a group quite a bit. Although, as you'll see in this video, they are separate groups, And they do have some different powers and responsibilities. So what we'll look at is what they do together first, and then the difference between the two second. So here's our shared powers of Congress. And these are called expressed powers. You see that down at the bottom of the screen in the blue lettering. Expressed powers means that if you looked in the Constitution, you would see these powers written down in black and white, kind of like a rule book. It says these powers are the powers of Congress. Now that means they're not the powers of the president, they're not the powers of the courts, they're not the powers of the states. Congress has these powers, and there they are. We already know making laws and policies. All taxing and spending laws come from Congress. You may not realize this, but the power to declare war comes from Congress as well. And here's where we kind of look at this list. One of these things, what these things on the list have in common is they're all pretty big powers. I mean, taxing and spending is a big deal. That was a big part of why we had a revolution with England. Declaring war is a really big deal, as it has huge impacts on the people of our country. So what we're doing here is we're giving powers to Congress that it would be not good to have in the hands of one person. You don't want the president to have sole power to declare war, because if they did, they could declare war for any old reason they wanted to, maybe a reason that only served them. So these powers really are better served in the hands of a group, not one individual. Organizing our courts falls to Congress. So the Supreme Court right now has 9 members. It could have more. It could have less. It hasn't. But if Congress wanted to add to it, as they're discussing, they could do that. May not be a good idea, so they might keep it right where it is at 9. So that's what they're looking at right now. It's their power, though, to decide what courts look like. Coining money. Only the Congress can make money here. The states certainly can't. Admitting new states comes to Congress. So when Puerto Rico, for example, if they ever petition for statehood, they have the population, they'd be petitioning Congress to admit them as a new state, as the 51st state, if that ever becomes a possibility. It's being talked about. I'm not sure it's going to happen anytime soon, but it's definitely under discussion. Setting weights and measure standards. So the reason why we use the English system of pounds and inches and miles as opposed to kilometers and kilograms and meters is because Congress has kept us on that English system. Not many still do the English system. Most of the world is metric, but we've stuck around to the English system. If we ever change, Congress will have to change it. The only ones who can raise an army and organize it's Congress, and one thing that's specified is they control a post office as well. So these are 9 powers that are listed in the Constitution as things Congress gets to do. So pretty simple, right? Here's a list of what Congress does, and that's what they do. Well, it's complicated a little bit, because there's also something called implied power. Implied means you don't say it, but it's there. And that comes down to a thing in the Constitution known as the Elastic Clause. The Elastic Clause says that Congress also has the power to pass any laws that are necessary and proper. Now, that gives a lot of leeway for Congress to make laws. If they feel it's necessary, if they feel it's proper to make a law decision, then Congress has the power to do it. An example, the National Bank. Congress has made a national bank and later created what's known as the Federal Reserve System now. Now, it doesn't say in the Constitution, in black and white, Congress has the power to create national banks. It also doesn't say they can't. So Congress decided on a few occasions that having the government in charge of controlling the supply of money and helping to regulate it would be good for the economy. And Congress feels it is necessary and proper to do things that are good for the economy, like creating a national bank or the Federal Reserve. Now, not everyone thinks they're good for the economy, but Congress did. And they used the Elastic Clause, the part that says, Congress, it may not say you've got the power to make a national bank, but if you feel it's necessary and proper, you've got the power to do that. And they did it. A recent example is Congress enforced the 2012 federal kidnapping law. Now, nothing in the Constitution refers to kidnapping, but stopping kidnapping is a really good thing, Congress says, and it's kind of necessary for the federal government to have the power to do that. So we are going to weigh in and create this federal kidnapping law and make sure it's enforced by the president. It doesn't say anywhere we have the power to do it, but seems necessary to us. All those things are under the Elastic Clause. If Congress feels it's necessary or proper to do something for the good of the country, then they can do that too, and not just those powers listed here. So those are your powers you know Congress has. If they deem something necessary, they'll do it as well. But there's a catch. Just because Congress says it's necessary doesn't mean it is. And here's an example of a check and a balance that we'll start looking at more later. Remember, it's the courts that interpret law. They tell us what laws mean. So just because Congress says something's necessary doesn't mean it is. And the Supreme Court will make the final call. And here's an example of this. In the late 1800s, Congress created an income tax. To raise money for the government, they started taxing people based on their income, the amount of money they made. Now, if you go back here, it says taxing and spending is a power of Congress, but doesn't talk about what type of tax. And the idea of taxing people's income directly, taking money directly out of their paychecks, was not something that occurred to the people who made the Constitution. Congress, 100 years later, said, we're going to do it. We think it's necessary to make money for the government. Now, eventually, the Supreme Court said, nope, an income tax is not necessary. You might like it, Congress. You might think it's a good idea, but it's not a necessity. And we're not sure you have that power because we're not sure the Constitution grants it to you. So you can't make an income tax. It's an example of the Supreme Court kind of being the final authority on what laws mean, in this case, on the elastic clause. Congress says, we think this is necessary. Supreme Court says, we don't think it is. And, of course, the Supreme Court has the final say. Now, what you can do and what was done in this situation, because a question that always comes up is, well, don't we have an income tax today? We do. The 16th Amendment was created after the Supreme Court ruled, and the 16th Amendment says Congress has the power to make an income tax. So when the Supreme Court said it doesn't say in the Constitution, well, the Constitution was changed, so it does say specifically Congress can make an income tax. So if the Supreme Court does say this isn't necessary, you can always change the Constitution. As we'll see later, it's not easy, though, to change the Constitution. It just happened in that case. Point being, though, Supreme Court will tell you what is necessary and what isn't, and they define it, not Congress. So the elastic clause gives Congress some pretty far-reaching powers, but not unlimited power. They can't just say this is necessary and that's it. Supreme Court can weigh in on it eventually, too. And, of course, as we'll look at later on, a lot of the things we list with Congress will somehow include that executive branch. The president is going to be involved with a lot of things Congress does. But we'll specifically look at that in a couple of presentations from now when we start looking at the presidency and the executive branch. We'll set out what Congress does first. We'll add the president on top of that to kind of see, all right, how's the president now going to work with Congress? So Congress was designed to be the most powerful of our three branches, but you'll see how Congress's hands are tied by working with the president, and, of course, the Supreme Court can say to Congress, nope, that isn't necessary, and rein their power in that way, too. So let's talk a little bit about the Senate versus the House now that we've kind of looked at what both groups do together. Now, remember two things here again from the beginning of the video. The House is based on population. States with large populations get more votes. The Senate's based on equal representation for all states. Each state's got two. And one more thing to remember as well. Remember that at first, up until 1913, we did not let the people elect the Senate. The state legislature did. People elected the House. But the problem was the people were mostly illiterate at that time. We didn't have public education, so a lot of folks never learned to read or write. And there was some justified worry about letting an illiterate population have full control over who serves in our national government. So the compromise was, we'll let the people vote for one, the House, but we'll let the people not vote for the other, the Senate. Their state Congress will take care of that. Now, that's been changed a little more than 100 years ago, but at first, that's how it worked. And that's why the Senate's going to have a little more trust and some more duties and powers. We trusted them more because they, at first, were not elected by the illiterate population, so they got some more trust. So let's look at the difference between the two. Here's some special House powers. There's only a couple of things they can do. First, While it's true, as you'll see, that bills, laws, policies can be created by both the House and Senate, and they'll both combine in making those laws and policies, only the House can create tax laws. And there's a reason for that. If you think about this, you might come up with it before I explain. But remember that the House is based on population. Who is going to pay taxes? Right, the people are. And which states will likely be paying more in taxes? Yeah, the big ones with more people. So tax laws clearly are going to affect California more than they affect Maine, simply because there's more people in California who are paying taxes. So because of this, the House has the power to be the ones to draft up and create every one of our revenue or tax bills. Now, that doesn't mean they can do whatever they want and the Senate doesn't have input on it. They do. But when it comes to creating them, to drafting them, to making them, the House gets to do that. The Senate might offer suggestions and change them, and I'll show you that procedure. Actually, next time I see you in class, I'll show you that procedure. However, only the House gets to create what goes in a tax bill. That's one of its two powers that it has over the Senate. The other is in an impeachment. And an impeachment is when a president or other government official, usually it's the president, although it doesn't have to be the president. Let's use the president because it's happened recently to former President Trump. What happens in an impeachment is the House has the ability to research, investigate any idea or allegations, any suggestions of wrongdoing by a president. And if the House investigates and finds that there might be, they will take a vote as to whether or not to charge the president with those crimes. That's what an impeachment is, the act of charging a president with a crime. Many Americans think impeachment is the act of kicking out a president. Well, they're partially right. You can't do that without impeaching them first. But impeachment simply means we're voting to have a trial because we think you may have committed illegal acts and you might need to be removed. So that's happened, and the House gets to do that. When Donald Trump was impeached, both times, what happened was the House investigated, the House decided it was going to press charges, and the House together voted on whether or not they were going to press charges against President Trump. When the House by majority voted yes, President Trump was impeached. Now, he was not removed either time, and I'll tell you how that works, because that's a Senate power, and we'll get to that in a bit. And as it says here, the Senate's got a role to play in both tax bills and in impeachments, but only the House can initiate. Only the House can start those and get the ball rolling. So it doesn't matter how badly the Senate might want to impeach a president. They can't do it unless the House is the one to start the charges. And it doesn't matter how much Senator Collins may want a tax bill to get passed. She can't author one. She's got to wait for the House to do it before she will have any involvement. So that's really it for House powers. Because they were the ones elected by the illiterate population, they don't have a lot of special duties. The Senate's got more. And there's enough of them that I'll give everyone its own slide. First of all, the Senate's going to approve all treaties. A treaty is any deal between the United States and one or more foreign countries. As you'll see when we talk about the president, it's the president's responsibility to create treaties. But any treaty the president creates is not official until 2/3 of the Senate give it the thumbs up and say, we like this. The House has no input on treaties, only the Senate. And they're the ones to approve whether or not a presidential treaty is going to be accepted. You see in the picture, that is President Trump meeting with a couple of Middle Eastern leaders to work out a treaty that made the Middle East more peaceful. That treaty would have to be approved by the Senate, and it was, by 2/3 vote. Number 2, the Senate approves all appointments. And we'll get back to this too, but an appointment is when the president picks somebody for a government job. Here you see a picture of Amy Coney Barrett. She was the most recent Supreme Court justice picked by President Donald Trump. Now, when President Trump picked her, she does not automatically get a seat on the Supreme Court. The Senate will then get the ability to interview her and then vote thumbs up or thumbs down. Now, the Senate has not voted thumbs down, I don't believe, to a presidential Supreme Court nominee since the 1980s with a guy named Robert Bork, who Reagan picked. But everyone who's gone up since then on my wall, my Supreme Court section of my wall, they were all picked by a president. But they did not get to serve in the Supreme Court until the Senate said so. So the Senate's got that role to advise and consent the president and to approve or not approve whether or not an appointment, Supreme Court, cabinet position, and we'll talk about those more later. But the Senate has the final call as to whether a president's pick gets that job or if they don't. The House has no say in it. We talked impeachments. Remember, the House will start the charges. It's the Senate, though, who are the jury. They'll hear the trial. They will sit and listen to the evidence presented against a president, in this case, President Trump. But to remove a president, it takes a 2/3 vote. Now, we've impeached presidents on 4 occasions. Trump twice, Bill Clinton once in the 90s, and the first one going back to the 1860s, a guy named Andrew Johnson. And on 0 of those 4 times has the Senate voted by 2/3 vote to kick out a president. It's only been close once. They were 1 vote shy from removing Andrew Johnson back in the 1860s. But since then, it's not been close. We want to have a system where you can remove a president if there's a reason to do that. We just don't want to make it easy. So 2/3 is an achievable total to get, but it's not an easy total to get. So in the situation, if a president is impeached, it takes a 2/3 vote to kick them out. And the Senate are the ones who vote. The House does not vote on whether or not we should kick out a president. So those are the 3 big powers. There are a couple more we'll talk about later, such as the filibuster. The Senate has the ability to do that, as well as rider power too. But I'm going to bring that up when it comes time to show you how policies are made. So we'll kind of hold off at those 3 for now. But those 3 are pretty big powers and duties that the Senate has that the House does not have. And again, the reason why, we trusted the Senate more. They were not elected by the illiterate population. So let's go on to some more new stuff as far as how we elect our House and Senate members. It's not always been simple. When the country started, as I've been alluding to throughout this entire presentation, most people couldn't read or write. There was no way we're going to give the illiterate population the power to elect both the House and Senate. We knew that because we just couldn't trust them to elect the people who were going to be good leaders. The illiterate population would need to be given some trust because if you didn't give them any vote, they'd rebel. But we couldn't give them the full vote. So, if you've seen this part, by the way, I have a slide here someplace. Yeah, it should go here. If you've seen this part, by the way, you can skip ahead to a slide that looks like this. It says who gets elected, and we'll talk about who we vote for. So if you were already in class and you saw the system we used to use that involves the House of Representatives, you can take the slider at the bottom of this video, slowly scroll ahead until you see that slide right down at the bottom. It looks like this. When you get to that who gets elected slide, you can then start the video up again. If you haven't seen the original way that we've elected the president, it won't be very long, but stick with me for that part if you don't know it already. There was a compromise made there as well, and it looks like this. Since we had a House and a Senate, there was a way to compromise between giving the people all power and no power to elect their leaders. We gave them some power. As you can see here on the left of the diagram, the people in each state directly elect their House of Representatives. And they pick whoever they want. Now, there's a couple of rules for this, which we'll get to, but they can pick who they choose to. Today, that's true for the Senate as well, but it didn't used to be. Back in the day, what would happen is the people of each state, they would pick their state legislature and state Congress, kind of like the one we have today right down the road from us down in Augusta. Every state's got their own state legislature, their own state Congress, that makes laws specific to those states. What used to happen is those state legislatures, like ours in Augusta, would then pick the 2 senators from each state. And there's a compromise. People had direct say and picked exactly who they wanted for the House. They had indirect say for the Senate. They picked their state legislatures. But the state legislatures and not the people were the ones who picked the Senate. Now, in 1913, that changed because by 1913, we didn't have an illiterate population anymore. By then, we had public schools. And while most people, not as many people as today, go all the way through high school and graduate grade 12, most were getting through so they could read or write, and our illiterate population was a lot smaller a percentage of our total population than it was when our country first started. But up until that time, we had a House and a Senate. They were elected by different people, and because of that, again, we know their powers and duties are different. There's also some difference in how they get elected. We'll take a look at that right now. There's my slide about in 1913, the way it's changed to how it looks today. And again, people electing both the House and Senate today. We got to vote back in November as to whether or not we wanted Susan Collins or whether we wanted, I'm blanking on it. I can't believe that. From Freeport, the former House, Sarah Gideon. Or if we wanted Sarah Gideon to serve in the Senate. And the people got to vote on that. Had it been 1910, then it would have been the state legislature in Augusta who would have picked for us. But we have picked it, and that's the model we look at right now. So who do we elect? Well, there's some requirements. First of all, the House. You have to be 25 years old. You got to live in the district you represent. If you're not familiar with districts, and I'm guessing most of you are not, I'm going to show you that in just a second. And you must be a United States citizen who has lived here for 7 years. So let's say you're a United States citizen, and at age 18, you decide to go to the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. And you get your degree there, and you get a graduate degree, and at age 25, you come back to Maine. Well, you've been in Scotland the last 7 years. You're 25. You're old enough to run for the House to represent Maine, but you haven't been here. So it kind of means you really haven't lived among the people and understood the issues that face the people of Maine. It means you got to live here 7 years until you run. And by the way, citizen means any type of citizen. As long as you're a United States citizen, whether you were born a U.S. citizen or you became one sometime later in life, you can run for the Senate and the House. The House gets a 2-year term, meaning that when you're elected, you're there for 2 years until you have to face the voters again in an election. For the Senate, again, we trusted them more. They got a 6-year term. To be in the Senate, you got to be a little older, 30 years old. You're still going to live in the state you represent, not the district. Again, I'll explain that. And you got to be a citizen who lives here more than 9 years. So we raised the bar a little bit there, too. Now, these decisions and just having a few requirements allows the people a wide range of candidates. You don't want to have so many requirements that you take away the people's right to really choose who they want. We have an age requirement of 25 or 30 just to make sure that someone's got enough life experience to do the job. And living in the state or the district means that you're always going to have the people's best interests in mind that you serve, because you live there too. If you didn't live there, you might not have their best interests in hand. You might be looking more at where you live. I mean, if I live in Massachusetts, I shouldn't represent Maine because the decisions I make might benefit Massachusetts more. And of course, being a citizen is kind of self-explanatory. You got to make sure you put America first, too. We already mentioned why you got to live here for several years. And we already mentioned, too, the Senate gets a longer term because we trust them more. See, if you give someone 2 years, they do a lousy job. You're never more than 2 years away from getting them out. Well, the Senate, we're not quite as concerned that they're going to be a bad pick, so we're more likely to give them more time and, in fact, give them 6 years. So let's talk states versus district. A state's easy. When you're the senator, you represent the entire state. Our 2 senators are Susan Collins and Angus King. In 2020 and back in 2018, when we elected our senators, the voters from the entire state got to weigh in on that, from all the way at the top of the state, up in Madawaska, down to Kittery, home of Trape Academy. We've met them a few times playing Halldale sports. And everywhere in between, we all vote for senators. Now, you'll notice the senators are not elected the same year. They're on different rotations. They both get a 6-year term. But Susan Collins was elected in 2020. She will be up for re-election in 2026. Now, we'll see if she runs again, because she is Maine's senior senator, meaning she's been there the longest of the two. Senator Collins was elected back in 1996. She's already been there 25 years. Whether she wants to go again will be her choice. We'll see. But in 2026, that's the next time we'll get to decide if we want Susan Collins as our senator. And by we, I mean the entire state. Senator King was elected in 2018. He's up for re-election in 2024. Now, he's our junior senator, meaning he hasn't been there as long as Susan Collins. He got there in 2012. Whether or not he will continue to go remains to be seen. He might not. But when 2024 rolls around, we'll have the choice again to vote for who represents Maine as our junior senator. And this is called a staggered term. The reason we do this is, let's say Susan Collins lost in 2020 and Sarah Gideon won that election. She'll be brand new to the Senate, a rookie, who's got to learn some stuff about that job. But Mainers will still be served by an experienced senator, Angus King, who's already been there since 2012. If Angus King doesn't run for Senate and we have a new senator, they'll be brand new to the job in 2024. But they'll have 2 years to learn on the job, and while they're doing that, Senator Collins is still there as an experienced senator. So we're making sure that no matter what, you've always got someone in your state who is experienced to represent you in the Senate. That's why those staggered terms. We elect the House every 2 years, but the senators all have 6-year terms, but they're on different rotations. King's term 2018 to 2024. Collins' term 2020 to 2026. 6 years for both, but the 6 years start and end at a different staggered time for that reason. House members are different. They represent a district, and here's our state. Your member of Congress, your member of the House, depends on where you live in Maine. Now, in the Senate, all Mainers are represented by two people, Susan Collins and Angus King, two senators. Each American has one representative in the House. So there are two from Maine, but my representative is actually different than your representative, and here's how. Here's where the lines are drawn in Maine. The way we draw those lines, we try to make the districts equal. Now I know what you're thinking. You're looking at that and saying, Kennedy, orange is way bigger than the red. And you're right, size-wise. But population-wise, those districts are about even. They're right around 600,000 people because Maine's got 1.2 million people. And since we have two members of the House, we break it somewhat in half as close as we can. Now, on the map, all of you, Hallowell, Farmingdale, Dresden, Chelsea, all of those districts are here in the red. But look at this little finger right here that kind of sticks into the red area. Monmouth is right there on the line, and I live in Monmouth. So my representative is District 2. Your representative in Washington, D.C. comes from District 1. Now, this is good. It means that every American's got three representatives down in Washington, D.C. His or her two senators and his or her one House member. I mean, imagine being in a big state if you had to remember 53 House members. You don't. No matter where you live, just one. So that's what it looks like in Maine. In Massachusetts, for example, you've got, 12 districts there, I guess. Massachusetts is bigger than I thought. I thought it was 10. Actually, 12 districts. And like in Maine, Massachusetts, those districts are the same size. And again, we're not talking about size-wise geographically. Clearly, the one out in Brown, out in the western side of Massachusetts, is the biggest. But that's also the part of Massachusetts where fewest people live. Massachusetts is like Maine. A lot of their people are packed into one area, and you can tell where. It's all right here around Boston. In Maine, most of our population is down there. Not as many people live up here. Let me get rid of these two notifications here. That's better. So since states have different amounts of people, each state's going to have a different district. All right, hold on a second. I see another warning I do have to take care of. That's my low battery warning, so quick pause. Hold on. All right, there I go. That would make me very angry if I talked 25 minutes into a video and lost the entire video. But every state's got roughly 600 to 650,000 people. Sorry, every district has that. And that way, we keep it fair that every American has 3 members in the House and Senate, his 2 senators and her 1 House member. Now, every representative is elected by the people of his or her district for a 2-year term. So every 2 years, people in District 1, your district, get to vote. Last November, they re-elected Shelley Pingree. My district, District 2, elected Representative Jared Golden. So that's who serves here in Maine. Your rep is Shelley Pingree. If you want something done in Washington, if you wrote Jared Golden, he might respond and listen, but I would be more his priority than you because I'm in his district. He only represents the orange part of Maine, whereas Shelley Pingree represents that brownish-red part of Maine, where you live. And they all have 2-year terms. So that's what districts look like, and every state does it differently. And they get to draw their own districts as well. So I'm going to introduce you to a term here you might see come up later. Sometimes, because a lot of times these districts are drawn by the members of the House and Senate of each state, and the states draw their own, because politicians draw them, sometimes those politicians decide they want to draw the lines that give their party an advantage so that their party can win as many of those districts in an election as they possibly can. When politicians draw those lines to give a party an advantage, it's called gerrymandering. Government's got a lot of weird-sounding terms. Gerrymandering comes from a representative named Elbridge Gerry from Massachusetts. And Massachusetts, back in the 1790s, they drew their districts in a way so that Elbridge Gerry and his Federalist Party would have an advantage. And someone said, that district looks like a salamander. Well, they combined the 2 words, Elbridge Gerry's last name and salamander, to get gerrymandering. And this is a visual representation of when you can usually tell gerrymandering. Look over there on the right in the state of Iowa. Iowa draws its districts by committee, and there's an equal number of Republicans and Democrats on the committee, so neither party has an advantage. That way, they have to compromise in a way that's fair to both sides, or the plan won't be supported. So right there in Iowa, it's got 4 districts, and you can kind of see they're really kind of divided up in a fairly logical way with a lot of straight lines. Now, look at the one on the, on the left. That's North Carolina. Look at that thin one that kind of looks like a river. The other one looks like one of those ink splot tests, the Rorschach tests. Sometimes you take in a psychiatrist's office, and they ask you, what do you see here? But when you see a lot of really kind of thin sections that barely touch, oftentimes that's being done to kind of put a place in where you've got more Republicans or Democrats, and that way their party wins. That's called gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is legal up to a point. We'll explain that later on when it's not. But if you do cross the line and try to say gerrymander in a way so that a certain group of people, let's say black people, Hispanic people, are given a disadvantage, the courts can say, nope, draw them again. And in fact, that's what happened to these districts. The court said, no, these are illegal gerrymanders, draw those again. But sometimes that happens in politics, that parties try to draw the lines in a way that their party has an advantage. It didn't happen in Iowa because that system doesn't allow for it, but other states don't have that. We don't have it in Maine either, but of course, we're only looking at 2 districts, so it's a lot harder to gerrymander. Not impossible, but a lot harder to gerrymander when you only have 2 districts to mess around with. When you've got a bunch like the Carolinas do, and you've got like 13 districts, then it's a little more easy to gerrymander because you have a lot of lines to draw. So I wanted to throw that term out for you because sometimes that does come up, and people do hear that from time to time. When all is said and done, There are 535 members of Congress, 100 senators, and 435 representatives. And as I've told you a couple times already, I'll say once again, every citizen of the United States, every man, woman, and child, every resident of the United States has 3 people representing them in Washington, D.C. 2 senators and the House member who represents the district in which they live. Now, it works the same way in Maine, too, by the way. Let's talk about local government, because every state has its own state legislature that I told you about earlier. So Maine works the same way. In Maine, you've got 1 senator and 1 House member representing you, and that depends on where you live. On the left here, all those colored squares are a district in Maine. There are 151 of them. And just like the ones we do for the national government, we try to make them around equal size. Now, I should have looked this up, but I forget the number Maine's going for as far as population for each size. But you can certainly tell it's based on population, because there's some really big districts up there in the northern and eastern part of the state. And as you get down to the southern part of the state, around Portland, Cumberland County, those districts shrink big time in size. 151 representatives meeting in Augusta, and we have different ones. I'll show you who they are in just a second. In the Senate, what you're looking at here are those numbers. 35 Maine senators. Technically, they're representatives too, but the proper term is senators, so I'm going to change that. There are 35 Maine senators, and again, it depends where you live. The senator from up here in Eagle Lake, Maine, is going to represent Eagle Lake. And the other areas of Aroostook County, whereas where I came from, down here in southern Maine, I had a senator that would have been from Cumberland, or Cumberland County down here. In that way, we're representing, again, based on population size, all Mainers. Here's who they are. Your state representative differs on where you are, because Farmingdale is in a different district than Hallowell, Dresden, and Chelsea. You can see that if you live in Farmingdale, Tom Harnett is your current state rep. Charlotte Warren, who's been both a senator and a representative, is currently the representative for Hallowell if you live there. And Allison Harper from Dresden, Chloe Maximin if you live across the river in Chelsea. So again, looking at the map here, we don't see exactly where they are, but it's right around this area. Now we're looking at a bunch of different representatives, and depending on where you are, that would be yours. Bigger districts in the Senate, your state senators are the same. Hallowell, Farmingdale, Chelsea, including me out in Monmouth, we're represented by Craig Hickman. He was just elected a few weeks ago, actually, as I say this, in early April of 2021. We actually in November voted for Shenna Bellows. But Shenna Bellows was then picked to be Maine's Attorney General. And in doing that, she could not serve in the Senate anymore. So we had to have a special election to fill her role. And in that special election, we elected Senator Hickman. If you live in Dresden, Eloise Vitelli is your senator, because Dresden is in another Senate district here in the state of Maine. So even states break things down to make sure every American, every resident of their state, is fairly represented. Now, what we'll talk about next is the presidency. And we'll break it down into 2 different parts. We'll first talk about the president's roles, responsibilities, and powers. And then we'll spend a separate lesson dealing with what some of you already know a bit about, the Electoral College, which is the way we elect the president in this country. We have a different system for electing the president than the way we elect our House and Senate members. So that's all coming up next time. Today, wanted to get you a look at what the House and Senate do, what their shared powers are. Wanted to get into the elastic clause, their implied power. Take a look at how we elect them, as well as what it looks like at the state level as well, because the states are doing the same type of thing for the government that serves here in Maine, right down the road next to us, down in that big white building in Augusta. We'll start off next class with any questions you might have on any of this. And we'll then start talking a bit about presidential power in class and get to the Electoral College after that.